Okay, hi everyone. Welcome back to this live stream for Windows Server 2003. So I just want to share my screen. Okay, the networking tab. You use the networking tab to control which protocols your client will attempt to use when communicating with other servers. You have to tell DUN what kind of server it's calling in the first place using the type of dial-up I am calling field. Your choices are PPP or SLIP, the serial line internet protocol, now relegated to older Unix machines, and dial-up hardware. By default, PPP was selected, and it's unlikely that you'll need to change it. Alternatively, the VPN networking tab uses the top drop down menu to let you indicate what kind of VPN call you're making. Automatic is the default setting, but you can select a PPTP or L2TP connection if you prefer. The list box in the middle of the tab shows the network protocols installed on the client. Protocols marked with a check are available for use with this connection. Normally you will see TCP/IP and the client from Microsoft Networks marked, which indicates that those two protocols can be used over the connection. To install, uninstall, and properties buttons work just as they do in the local area connection properties dialog. By using them, you can control which protocols are on your machine and what their settings are. It's worth mentioning that selecting Internet Protocol TCP/IP in the protocols list and opening its properties dialog box gives you access to a set of properties that are completely distinct from any TCP/IP settings that may apply to your LAN interfaces. Normally, the dial-up TCP/IP settings are configured to obtain an IP address and DNS information from the remote server, although if you need, you can override these settings. The sharing tab contains only two controls: enable internet connection sharing for the connection and enable on-demand dialing. This tab is only available with RAS client. On-demand dialing provides a way to automatically dial the connection whenever a computer on the local network attempts to access information on the remote network. In exercise 7.8, you will learn how to create a VPN connection on a Windows XP client. So 1, choose Start, right-click My Network Places and select Properties. 2, click the Create a New Connection icon. The new connection wizard appears. Click the Next button. 3, choose to connect to the network at My Workplace button and click Next. 4, choose the VPN connection radio button and click Next. 5, enter a descriptive name for the connection and click Next. 6, choose the Do Not Dial the Initial Connection radio button and click Next. 7, enter the IP address of the VPN server. Click Next when you're done. 8, the wizard summary page appears. Click Finish. 9, the Connect dialog box appears. Make sure that you connect to the internet. Enter a username and password and click the dial button to connect. So, summary. In this chapter, you learned about the following topics: how to install and configure routing remote access services to handle dial-in connections, how to configure appropriate encryption and security settings so that communication between the client and the server is encrypted and authenticated, how to install RRAS to provide VPN service using the PPTP and L2TP protocols, how to configure VPN services on the server and client, how to troubleshoot common VPN problems. So now I'll move on to chapter 8, managing user access to remote access services. So Microsoft exam objectives covered in this chapter. Troubleshoot user access to remote access services, diagnose and resolve issues related to remote access VPNs, diagnose and resolve issues related to establishing a remote access connection, diagnose and resolve user access to resource beyond the remote access server. So probably the biggest change in remote user access from NT4 is that Windows 2000 and Server 2003 finally allowed you to apply remote access policies. With Windows NT, you could control whether or not individual users could dial in, but there was no way to set that permission for groups of users. The Windows Server 2003 Group Policy Object GPO provides a way to apply dial-up permission and capability settings to groups of users. This chapter explains how remote access policies and profiles are used to grant or deny user access to resources on the network across remote connections. We'll begin by looking at the different authentication protocols included with Windows Server 2003, and you'll see how the operating system handles remote access security. Then we'll dive into the details of configuring user access with profiles and policies. You'll learn how to configure your server to use Windows authentication or Radius authentication, and Radius means remote access dial-in user service. Remote access security. In the past, remote access was seldom a part of most networks. It was too hard to implement, too hard to manage, and too hard to secure. It's reasonably easy to secure your networks from unauthorized physical access, but doing so for remote access was perceived as being much harder. There are a number of security policies, protocols, and technologies that have been developed to ease this problem. First, we'll discuss the user authentication protocols. User authentication. One of the first steps in establishing a remote access connection involves allowing the user to present some credentials to the server. You can use any or all of the following 5 authentication protocols that Windows Server 2003 supports. Password Authentication Protocol, PAP. Password Authentication Protocol is the simplest and least secure authentication protocol. It transmits all authentication information in clear text with no encryption, which makes it vulnerable to snooping. In addition, it provides no way for a client and server to authenticate each other because other protocols offer better security. PAP is falling out of favor, and Microsoft recommends turning it off unless you have clients that cannot use a more secure protocol. Shiva Password Authentication Protocol. Shiva Password Authentication Protocol, SPAP, is a slightly more secure version of PAP that's primarily intended for talking to remote access hardware devices made by the Shiva Corporation. It's included it's included for backward compatibility but isn't widely used. Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol, sometimes called MD5 chat because it uses RSA. MD5 hash algorithm has a major security advantage over PAP. It doesn't transmit password information in the clear. Instead, the server sends a challenge encrypted with the DES algorithm to the client, which must decrypt it and return the correct response. This allows the server to verify the user's credentials without sending those credentials across an insecure link. Although NT's RAS client can use CHAP when dialing into a third-party device, an unmodified NT RAS server will not support CHAP clients. This is because CHAP requires that the server stores passwords in clear text for security purposes. The Security Account Manager SAM database stores NT passwords as a hash, never in clear text. Microsoft CHAP was created by Microsoft as an extension of the CHAP protocol to allow the use of Windows authentication information, among other things. That's what the log on with dial-up networking checkbox in the Windows Server 2003 log on dialog box does. There are actually two separate versions of MS Chat. Version 2 is much more secure than version 1, and all Microsoft operating systems upgraded with their respective service packs support version 2. Some other operating systems support MS Chat version 1 as well. Extensible Authentication Protocol. Extensible Authentication Protocol EAP doesn't provide any authentication itself. Instead, it relies on third-party authentication methods that you can retrofit to your existing servers. Instead of handwriting any one authentication protocol, a client-server pair that understands EAP can negotiate an authentication method. The computer that asks for authentication is called the authenticator. The authenticator is free to ask for several different pieces of information, making a separate query for each one. This allows the use of almost any authentication method, including secure access tokens like Secure ID, one-time password like S-key, or ordinary username password system. Each authentication scheme supported in EAP is called an EAP type. Each EAP type in turn is implemented as a plug-in module. Windows Server 2003 can support any number of EAP types at once. The routing and remote access services, or RAS server, can use any EAP type to authenticate if you've allowed that module to be used and the client has the module in question. Windows Server 2003 actually comes with the following two EAP types. EAP MD5 CHAP implements the version of CHAP that uses the MD5 hash algorithm. The EAP version of CHAP is identical to the regular version, but the challenges and responses are packaged and sent as EAP messages. This means that if you turn EAP MD5 CHAP on and disable regular CHAP on the server, plain CHAP clients won't be able to authenticate. EAP Transport Layer TLS allows you to use public key certificates as an authenticator. TLS, which you will recall from Chapter 7, Managing Remote Access and Services, is very similar to the familiar Secure Sockets Layer SSL protocol used for web browsers. When EAP TLS is turned on, the client and the server send TLS encrypted messages back and forth. EAP TLS is the strongest authentication method you can use. As a bonus, it supports smart cards. However, EAP TLS requires your RAS server to be part of a Windows 2000 or Server 2003 domain. There's a third EAP authentication method included with Windows Server 2003, but it's not really an EAP type. EAP Radius is a fake EAP type that passes any incoming message to a remote authentication for dial-in user service. Radius server for authentication, connection, security. There are some additional features you can use to provide connection level security for your remote access clients. You've already learned about one in Chapter 7, the Callback Control Protocol, CBCP. CBCP allows your RAS servers or clients to negotiate a callback with the other end. When CBCP is enabled, either the client or the server can ask the server at the other end to call the client back at a number supplied by the client or a pre-arranged number stored on the server. Another option is that the RAS server can be programmed to accept or reject calls based on the caller ID or automatic number identification (ANI) information transmitted by the phone company. For example, you can instruct your primary or AS server to accept calls from only your home analog line. While this keeps you from calling it when you're on the road, it also keeps the server from talking to strangers. Finally, you can specify various levels of encryption to protect your connection from interception or tampering. The exact type and kind of encryption used will vary according to the options you specify. Access control. Apart from the connection level measures you can use to prohibit outside callers from talking to your servers, you can restrict which users can make connections in a number of ways. First of all, you can allow or disallow remote access from individual user accounts. This is the same limited control you have in Windows NT, but is just at the start of Windows Server 2003. Besides turning dial-in access on or off for a single user, you can use remote access policies to control whether users can get access or not. Like group policies, remote access policies give you an easy way to apply a consistent set of policies to groups of users. However, the policy mechanism is a little different. You can create rules that include or exclude the users you want in the policy. Unlike group policies, remote access policies are only available in Windows 2000 native and Server 2003 domain functional level, that is, in domains in which there are no Windows NT domain controllers present. That means that you may not have the option to use remote access policies until your Windows 2000 and Server 2003 deployment is further along. In the next section, you will learn how to configure user access control. Configuring user access. In the previous chapter, you set up the server for accepting incoming calls. Now it's time to determine who can actually use the remote access services. You do this in two ways: by setting up remote access profiles on individual accounts, and by creating and managing remote access policies that apply to groups of users. This distinction is subtle but important because you manage and apply profiles and policies in different places. Using user profiles. Windows Server 2003 stores a lot of information for each user account. Collectively, this information is known as the account's profile, and it's normally stored in Active Directory. Some settings in the user's profile are available through one of the two user management snap-ins: Active Directory users and computers. If your or AS server is part of an Active Directory domain, or local users and groups if it's not. In either case, the interesting part of the profile is the dial-in tab of the user's property dialog box. This tab has a number of interesting controls that regulate how the user account may be used for dial-in access. So you can see here, figure 8.1, the dial-in tab of the user's properties dialog box. The controls include the following: the remote access permission, dial-in or VPN control group. The first and probably most familiar controls on this tab are in the remote access permission control group. They control whether the user has dial-in permission or not. They're similar to the controls you may remember from the Windows NT User Manager. However, Windows Server 2003 has a new feature. In addition to explicitly allowing or denying access, you can leave the access decision up to a remote access policy, provided you're using Windows Server 2003 in native mode. The Verify Caller ID checkbox or AS can verify a user's caller ID information and use the results to allow or deny access. When you check and verify caller ID checkbox and enter a phone number in the field, you're telling RRAS to reject a call for anyone who provides that username and password, but whose caller ID information doesn't match what you enter. The callback options control group. The callback options control group gives you three choices of regulation callback. The first and default setting, no callback, means the server will have no honor callback requests from this account. If you choose to set by caller radio button instead, the calling system can specify a number at which it wants to be called, and the RRAS service will call the client back at the number. The final choice, always call back to, allows you to enter a number that the server will call back no matter where the client's actually calling from. This is less flexible but more secure than the second option. The assign a static IP address checkbox. If you want one particular user to always get the same static IP address, you can arrange it by checking the assign a static IP address checkbox and then entering the desired IP address. This allows you to set up non-dynamic DNS records for individual users, guaranteeing that their machines will always have a usable DNS entry. On the other hand, this is much more error prone than the dynamic DNS DHCP combination you could be using instead. The apply static routes checkbox. In an ordinary LAN, you don't have to do anything special to clients to enable them to route packets. Just configure them with a default gateway and the gateway handles the rest. For dial-up connections though, you may want to define a list of static routes that will enable the remote client to reach hosts on your network or elsewhere without requiring the packets to be sent to a gateway in between. If you want to define a set of static routes on the client, you'll have to do it manually. If you want to assign static routes on the server, check the apply static routes checkbox and then use the static routes button to add and remove routes as necessary. So I'm going to leave it here today for this video. Thank you for listening and have a nice weekend.